Welcome to part 1 of Beware the Siren's Call, Chapter 8 of A Thora Silentblade Tale. Once again, Thora checked the bandages to see how things were healing. The armor had held up, but the dwarf had not fared quite as well. It was becoming a regular habit at this point to settle down for the evening and check to make sure how all the near-lethal wounds were healing. If Thora wasn't more careful, well, it didn't bear thinking about. There had been that moment earlier that day when Thora hadn't seemed to feel anything anymore, where it had been close. The dwarf had felt the pull. The soldier shook away these dark thoughts back to the present. Right now, the dwarf was surrounded by friends that had saved Thora's life earlier that day. It was strange to think how quiet a day it had started out as. A few days ago, they had left the silver mine behind, saying goodbye to the miners. It had been quite some time since Thor had been amongst dwarves, and it brought back a bit of the feeling of home. Tunnels under the mountains, good food, loud laughs. It was all very hard to walk away from. However, the adventurers had dreams of seeing Enker up close, and it would be a long road ahead of them. As they packed up the wagon with the supplies and gear they had found in the mines, Allendale broached the subject on everyone's mind. Are we certain the gnolls won't continue to be a threat? The bard asked, likely rhetorically. They've already tried to kill the dwarfs once. Do you think we could negotiate? Some sort of truce? Wondered Thora aloud. Seems like both parties could benefit. It was the wizard, Dwayne, who mapped out a tactical approach. We should arrive after nightfall, when the moons are high, see, began the turtle, drawing a crude map in the dirt with his peg leg. We stop just north of the camp, sticking to the road like any traveler. The sketch in the dirt outlined what appeared to be a giant tent off the main road, with what Thora assumed was the wagon positioned back on the main road. The dwarf approaches silently from the north to here, continued Dwayne, his peg leg slashing a moving motion across the dirt map. Report back, and then we make our move. It seemed like as good a plan as any. The wizard really had a knack for this type of thinking. Of course, if this was going to be a true negotiation, they would need to bring some of the dwarven miners with them. Fortunately, a few of the braver ones amongst the miners were willing to travel with them to the gnoll camp. Since it was a short ride to their agreed-upon stopping point, they would have to wait until sundown to get on the road if they wanted the full darkness of the night sky to cover their approach. This gave them all the time to prepare and gather their things. Once they hit the road, Thora guided their wagon effortlessly towards the camp, with Zarek again acting as advance scout on a horse up ahead. About an hour or two in, the elf had held up an arm to signal them to stop. In the distance, the light of a large fire was barely visible in the fields to the side of the main road. The group kept their words to a minimum, knowing what had to be done and wanting to attract as little attention as possible. Thora handed the reins to Allendale and hopped down, strapping both blades on in preparation. The soldier pulled a dark hood up to conceal himself as much as possible in the dim light of the moon, slipping noiselessly across the desert sand towards the nearby mesa. As Thora approached, the dwarf looked for signs of a lookout at the northern tip of the camp. The place was heavily fortified with wooden spears and fencing regularly spaced out, but the most obvious feature was a massive tent structure that seemed to dominate the near portion of the mesa. The dwarf reached the rock wall without incident, listening intently for the sounds of guards above. Just like in Grolnir, the warrior thought, remembering an early mission where Thor had been asked to climb a sheer cliff to assess an enemy position. Hopefully this one would work out better, though, because the dwarf was fairly certain they had fallen the last time. Placing one hand above the other, Thora tested the rock wall for grip and made the short climb up to the edge of the mesa, peering over the stone lip. There was not much other than storage and a strange sound coming from the large tented structure nearby. Scaling back down, Thora used the short mesa wall as a cover, slinking along and then climbing again, this time closer to the massive tent. The sight that greeted the dwarf was unexpected. The chanting sounds were coming from a circle of female gnolls who were gathered around a large stone slab in the center of the tent structure. Laid upon the slab, delicately positioned and holding a collection of flowers, was one of the dwarven miners that had left Wilted Gulch. Based on the description the other miners had provided, it was likely Mordrin, the dwarf who had gone to speak to the gnolls. The priestesses, if that's what they were, appeared to be holding some sort of funereal rite for the dead, though clearly a different tradition than the ones Thora was used to. Thora silently scaled back down to the ground below. They needed to regroup and come up with a decision based on what the dwarf had just seen. Quickly scouting out the defenses at the main gates, Thora gathered the basic intel they needed and returned to the group to consider their options. After relaying the seemingly peaceful approach taken by the gnolls and what seemed to be understaffed guard posts, it didn't seem like the tribe was posing any violent threat to the dwarven miners at the moment. Perhaps a more diplomatic approach could be used.